everybody, and welcome to episode 127 of ASBN Live. On behalf of the American Sustainable Business Network, I'm Tulasi Sivalingam, the Senior Manager of Events and Programming. I'm so thrilled we have some programming presented to us by one of our members, JumpScale. And today's session, as you know, is Cultures of Compassion in the Twilight of a Hyper-Masculine Economy. I'm pleased to have here with us Daniel Roth, who's a general partner and co-founder of JumpScale. He's an experienced social entrepreneur, movement strategist, and integrative healthcare professional focused on sustainable development, indigenous cultural revitalization, and healing arts. With him is Sean Harvey. Sean is a TEDx speaker, professor, interfaith minister, OD practitioner, systems thinker, and author of Warrior Compassion, Unleashing the Healing Power of Men. As the former head of personal transformation and well-being at Eileen Fisher, he shares insights and practices from his journey to develop change agents equipped to create cultures of compassion in hyper-masculine environments. I'm so excited to hear this conversation between the two of you, and it's now my pleasure to turn it over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Tulasi, and hello, everybody. This is Daniel Roth from JumpScale, and the conversation today that Sean and I are here to have is timely. It is heartfelt. It's at times painful and sad that this work is so needed in this time of violence, of brutality, of warfare. And yet there's still so much hope that many of us have for building cultures of compassion, for creating organizations and companies, movements, communities that really have values that include everyone and build a fair and sustainable world. So we're going to dive in. We're going to do a little bit of an introduction, and we're going to interview each other today and really have a conversation about these issues that Sean and I both care deeply about. I first really came to understand hypermasculinity in my childhood, growing up in Albany, New York, when I and many of my friends got to experience the police brutality of the war on drugs of the 1990s and watched police violence impact the communities around me in very visceral and painful ways. My father used to say that his hope was that I would get out of Albany without a police record. He had to change that hope. So his hope really became to get out of Albany alive. And that taught me early on really where hypermasculine and toxic masculinity can lead us in terms of how we police our communities and support each other in our addictions and in our how people care for mental health. So that was just the beginning of my journey to really unpacking and unraveling what it is to be born into a male gendered body and to try to build communities and organizations that really went beyond some traditional ideas of masculinity that were really hurting so many of our communities, and including men, women, and really everyone in our communities. That really only became possible for me after doing over a decade of men's circle work and really feeling the support, the emotional, spiritual, psychological support of other people who identify with masculinity and being in a male body, and being in circle together over many, many years. That process helped me really unpack some of the trauma and the norms that I had thought were just part of all cultures. And that really has helped me have a foundation in doing men's healing work today, coaching people who identify as male through executive leadership roles and doing healing work with people from all backgrounds, to really, understand how masculinity and femininity can get so out of balance in our cultures. And I'm really just so honored to be in this conversation with you, Sean. I've looked to Sean as a leader and as a mentor and as a friend. There's very few people I know that have gone as deep as Sean has, through seminary, through leading personal transformation work at Eileen Fisher, to doing work in extremely violence-oriented organizations like police departments and defense contractors. So I just know so few other people that have the breadth that you do, Sean. So I'm really honored to share this moment with you, to have this conversation in public for the ASBN community. So thank you, Sean. And I'm just so grateful to be here with you today.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. And I got to hear a little bit of your story that I haven't heard. So I appreciate that as well. And when we first connected, we knew we'd be doing some interesting work together. So I'm excited to be in this conversation with you. I'll add a couple of layers of context for my own journey and my commitment to this work. So I grew up the son of truck drivers. I was supposed to be a third generation long haul trucker, which did not quite happen. And I was also a gay kid. I was pretty androgynous as a child. So I was, from a very young age, I'm kind of unknowingly being brought into the masculine feminine conversation. And as I grew older, I took on attributes of the hypermasculine to combat all of the bullying that I'd experienced in my youth. Made some decisions along the way that led me to Wall Street, led me to become a college professor, and led me to ultimately work at Eileen Fisher as first the internal change agent for all creative, and then as the head of personal transformation and well-being for the company. But it was at Eileen, going from Wall Street to Eileen Fisher, that I saw this juxtaposition from an organizational systems perspective of hypermasculine work culture to hyperfeminine work culture. And in a feminine energy work culture, how men were being transformed. In some ways unknowingly. And seeing there's some value here. Often I tell folks, my experience at Eileen Fisher led me to seminary. Not because I'm religious or not because I'm overtly or overly spiritual, but because I knew that if we were going to create societal systems change and organizational systems change, as a systems thinker working backwards, that working with men in their healing work to become more integrated was going to be paramount to be able to create that opportunity for real systems change. But the work had to be done at the soul level. And so I went to seminary for the sole purpose of doing my own spiritual grounding work, to be able to hold men from a place of soul healing, to be able to then create the opportunities for transforming organizational and societal systems by creating opportunities for compassionate bridge building across gender. Really looking at power dynamics in new ways, looking at new models of leadership, and reimagining systems and structures, not just rethinking them from deeper consciousness, so that we could actually transform cultures in ways that were more conscious, compassionate, and connected. That journey, though, led me to having a one-on-one with the chief of police of Asheville, North Carolina, who had two asks. And so kind of going back to what you were saying, Dan. His ask to me, as I was really bringing my insight and wisdom from Eileen Fisher, to say, his ask for one, can I help him deepen the level of compassion among his officers? This is coming right after, about 2 months after the George Floyd killing? And then two, can I hold space and create conversations that bring officers and community members together so they can humanize each other for a new type of relationship going forward? And that was really the start of moving from this, what we've now created as a national initiative for compassion in policing that we hope will reach the over 18,000 departments across the US over time. So, just a little bit of the journey that where you saw the brutalization of officers, I've been able to start seeing the possibilities for healing among departments.
Yeah, well, reflecting on what I shared from my childhood, I really have high hopes, and it feels like that it must happen, that we have more compassionate policing in our country. And I think some folks are definitely not optimistic, but I know that it can make a huge difference. What you're doing and scaling that up will make a huge difference. It feels important to ground this conversation in what we've learned from the twilight of the hypermasculine economy, as we've called it for this conversation. That does feel like there was a kind of crescendo, a peak masculinity perhaps, and I think a lot of conversations I'm in these days that are understanding that has kind of peaked and where it's now twilighting. But it feels really important to understand what impact that had, and what we've kind of learned from those traditional office cultures that are problematic for so many people. I ended up myself in a military school as a teenager, and was literally leading platoons of young children to march in formation, as you would imagine people do at a military school. And it pretty much pained me to go to school every day. I learned a lot about what I didn't want in the world. I learned a lot about the way in which power structures within that kind of very hierarchical command and control structure work. And I was being asked to join that process and to be a lieutenant, to be a captain, to be a sergeant. And within all of that, there was a small kernel of the amount of trust and accountability that is required in those situations for them to be humanistic. And so it was a strange thing to start to see, but there was a kind of a sense of brotherhood, a sense of family that was somehow still alive in that structure. And I often think about, other communities I've worked in, like summer camps or businesses, where there is a sense of kind of community, of family. And so that's always been interesting to me, of like how to understand what was going on in those places like military schools, or at a power plant, for example, where I worked for many years in a very command control electric natural gas power plant. And safety was the name of the game. Every, check and balance and line of communication was about making sure that this power plant stayed safe to a certain degree. But some of those same very hyper-masculine command and control strategies were used, but around safety. So I've often had this mixed feeling about it all, like seeing some of the value in some of those structures and yet feeling how toxic they were. And I'm curious, Sean, just in your work and in your life, what have you picked up from some of those those cultures?
Yeah, I would say the limitation of those cultures, and I think for me, having worked in a number of multinationals, having been a business professor at a number of different colleges and universities, that probably the two things that are most avoided out in a lot of these cultures is emotional expression and access to creativity. And so there's often a rigidity in the pursuit of efficiency, effectiveness, and profitability that goes down the lines of sort of more rigid process design, which often is in this command and control environment. And as you and I have talked about many times, this sort of this fear-based control that can operate in these environments. And in that space, there's not a lot of room for the emotionality. There's not a lot of room for emotional expression or creativity. And when I think about it, we're often, I've been in a number of different experiences. I remember one at a human interaction lab in Virginia, being told, especially as men, we will intellectualize and rationalize our way out of feeling. And I think a lot of times, even when we talk about our emotions, we're still intellectualizing the idea of emotions as opposed to being able to truly experience and feel and embody those emotions, let alone to name them and identify them. From a creativity standpoint, I think oftentimes as we get older and we strip parts of ourselves away based on our conditioning, many men, but many leaders, many of us as we get older have lost touch with our true ability to be creative or our belief in our creativity. And so a lot of this, I believe, is a reclaiming. But I think a lot of our systems and our structures and our workplaces can contribute to the constriction that we have of our full expression and our wholeness. And that's why I believe, if we can bring more of a feminine energy that balances the masculine in organizational systems design, that we'll be able to, one, create gender bridge building, not just from a place of equity, but from a place of innovation to be able to solve challenges that are becoming more complex, more creatively and with greater innovation. And so I think those have been some of the, I think one, that the emotional expression, the access to creativity, and the ability to truly be authentic in the workplace and to bring your full authenticity. I think we spend a lot of time talking about purpose, which is great, but I think to really understand what it means in these cultures to bring a full level of authenticity, to bring emotional expression where there's a place for the emotional processing, for creativity, and then also to deepen the level of connection that we have with others in the workplace beyond the superficial.
I'm so glad you dropped the F-bomb, fear. I feel like that when I look back on the experiences I've had from power plants to military school to large organizations, fear was this underlying tool that got used again and again. And it was, even the when I mentioned safety, the power plant was all about safety. There was this underlying fear factor that managers and people in authority, of different parts of the chain would use to kind of get behaviors that they wanted out of the staff and out of the team. And it was definitely running rampant at a military school. You were scared to death of, from the bullying side of things to the, outright just being embarrassed by senior officers in that school. But I feel like there's so many ways in which getting beyond fear as a tool and paying really close attention to when that is coming up in our organizations it's a huge task, but it's I think it's going to be one that's going to help unlock that creativity and authenticity. And I know we're going to get a little bit more into some design principles later on around organizational design. And so we'll come back to this theme, but I'm just so glad you said it. It's like fear is alive and well in our organizations, and we can do something about it. It's not a tool that we have to always depend on as much as we have in these really masculine, kind of hyper masculine traditional organizations.
I agree with you, and we'll tap into more of this conversation on fear and its anecdote as we keep talking. You started us off talking about what do we learn from these traditional and hyper masculine environments. I want to ask, so what have we learned from the feminine centered leadership cultures and business models? I'll start by having gone from Wall Street to Eileen Fisher. I think at a certain point in my own experience, I started to talk to men in the culture. And a boss said to me once, she said, when you're at Eileen Fisher for a reason, and it's not for work. And someone else said, when you come to Eileen Fisher and you stay at Eileen Fisher, you're transformed by the company. And so I noticed that many employees were being transformed by just being in the culture. But men in particular were being transformed. And Eileen Fisher, was 83% women. And it wasn't even that the environment had feminine leadership or females in leadership. It's that the entire business model was based on the feminine. And by that, and we'll talk about some of the design principles in a minute, but it wasn't asking women, the culture wasn't asking women to act like men to succeed in business, but was really allowing women to operate in the feminine from a place of creativity, from a place of the organic, from sitting in the emergent. And that we would have meetings that were nuanced, where there wasn't a demand that we have an outcome by the end of the conversation, but that what emerged in the conversation was supportive of the thought process, the design process, the creativity that was essential to be able to create something great. But I think the culture also allowed for true authenticity. And I remember on my first day after an 8-month interview process, my two bosses sat me down and they said at lunch, so Sean, we want to just acknowledge that you have proven yourself in the interview process. Now we want you to stop proving yourself and learn how to be who you authentically are. Coming from Wall Street, they said, when you interviewed with us, you showed us your heart and you showed us your polish. We hired you for your heart, and we want to see less of your polish. And so that really created an opportunity to be supported in really finding my own authenticity. But as I talked to men in the company, probably about halfway through my tenure, I would say, hey, I feel like I'm changing, are you changing? And what I would hear is most often, my wife said that I'm more patient. I listen differently. I stopped needing to be right all the time, and I started to be more curious. I started to have more access to my emotions, and I was able to express more freely. I had more, I was able to tap into my creativity differently. I was solving problems differently. And ultimately, I was more comfortable in my own skin, and I was making space for others in ways that I hadn't before. And to me, this just felt like a powerful opportunity to bring this out. And I just kept saying, so what if more men have been exposed to this? And what if we were able to create true bridge building across gender? How might that help us innovate differently? And what if systems were redesigned from a place that took the best of the masculine and the best of the feminine for a true integration? And that's what led me on my journey post Eileen Fisher. but I think there's a real opportunity to reimagine organizational systems from a different level of balance.
Wow, thanks for taking us kind of into that journey. I started thinking about it just hit me that essentially from the age of right after college, so like 22 years old through like 26 years old, there was a 4-year period of my life. Really, I think it kept going, if I think about it, maybe a 6 or 7-year period, where my most important professional mentors were all women. Most of the organizations that I worked for were led by women, and were really being intentional about how to balance feminine and masculine leadership qualities. And I went deep into learning and following the path to become a massage therapist, to become a somatic movement therapist. And some of my my biggest teachers during that period of my life were all women who had really stepped into a kind of leadership that I think I've been looking for, and I've been trying to nurture in myself, and I've been even helping others find, which is, really interesting. I think what's happening so much in the world right now are women are actually finding that kind of balanced leadership much more powerfully than a lot of men I know are finding it, because they're, tuning into ancient traditions of feminine leadership and female leadership that go back to the beginning of time. And yet they're operating in this hyper-masculine world where they're finding a balance. And yet so many of the male leaders that I've worked with in progressive movements still struggle with that. They really are struggling. And I think I would say I'm struggling with it as well. Just so much training as a young man, and so much trauma and fear that created in me, that really you have to work through really intentionally to kind of step into like a full balanced leadership place. It's really challenging, but those mentors, those teachers, those bosses, those leaders that I was around, particularly I would say the ones in the somatic healing arts spaces, who were really carrying on traditions and lineages of deep healing, deep transformation work, many of them from multiple generations of women leaders. There was kind of these intact female leadership lineages that they were carrying. So there was a power, and there was a clarity that they could impart on anybody who wanted to learn or spend time with them, or be in the organizations that they were part of. And I think in many respects that those role models in my life, they are with me to this day in everything I do at JumpScale, in the kind of spacious emotional intelligence, the mindfulness, the balance of kind of the emergent, like you spoke about, and the planned, how to kind of find that balance, and like what does it feel like in your body when you are taking good action, like just paying attention to the body's wisdom in leadership moments, or moments of conflict, or maybe moments of team kind of expansion when you're hiring new people. There's like an intelligence in our bodies. Men, women, people of all backgrounds have an intelligence in their bodies. And those feminine-centered organizations, those healing arts organizations, those land-based organizations that I was a part of in my 20s taught me so much about how to pay attention to that inner experience. And it's like a compass that you can train yourself to pay attention to, and it can kind of just keep helping at so many key moments of leadership. I would not be, it's easy for me to say I would not be the leader I am today if it wasn't for those experiences. And I wouldn't have been able to be as creative as I was when I did end up working within a power plant structure with multiple tiers of engineers and architects around me. I would not have been able to show up as creatively and authentically as I did if I hadn't had those years of training in those really powerful feminine leadership organizations. It just wouldn't have happened.
I appreciate you saying that. I during my time at Eileen Fisher, Eileen was very committed to embodied leadership and brought Wendy Palmer in a lot as one of the many teachers of embodied leadership. And as we did the personal transformation work, the somatic work, the breath work, the limiting beliefs work, and the shadow work were all elements of the personal transformation work we brought to employees. Coming out of those spaces and now going back into more traditional environments, and then like hypermasculine environments of the places where I work with police officers and military. And it's often the biggest growth edge is what we were just talking about, which is to even show the value of why are we talking about our bodies? Why do we even need to have the embodiment work, and can we use other language beyond somatic or embodiment that's going to be more accessible? And so finding the ways to translate this work to reach a broader array of audiences has been one piece of the equation. But what I've also found in leading this work is it's one of those things where when you extend the invitation and someone experiences the relaxation, the meditation, the difference in self-awareness, it's often just extending an invitation and planting a seed that then this person has been exposed to and then can start to go on their own journey and to let go of any need to control what any of it looks like. But I believe for so many, when we bring the principles from the feminine into these masculine environments, one, it's translating in ways that it can be received, and then it's planting the seeds in ways that it can be activated, and then it's letting go of the need that has to look any way other than it's going to look, and really allowing each person who's touched by the work to be able to begin their own journey or to continue on their journey as one more passage along their path.
When you show up in a police department or in a defense contractor company, and you've got that awareness that you've gained from your time at Eileen Fisher, from all of your training as a organizational development expert, what are some of the things that you see, what jumps out at you within organizations that you think is undercutting the potential for really balanced feminine, masculine, kind of healthy leadership to take hold? Like, I'm just curious, what are some of the things that start to jump out at you these days when you go into those communities or into those organizations?
I think you named it before, which is fear. A lot of times we want more radical change, but there's a tolerance for incremental change. And I think a lot of that's steeped in fear of, where there's an exactness that's required either from a quality control perspective from a financial returns perspective, from tapping into the expectations of investors, and short-term returns. I think these factors lead back to that idea of fear of risk aversion. And so I think that's one piece. I think two, I think things are changing quickly sort of in society, but organizations are still playing catch up as to how they adapt. And leaders are, especially in larger organizations where they may be insulated, or so consumed by their own processes, their own departments, and their own work, that they may lose sight of what's happening in the outside world that's creating an influence. When I look at my own background, I think what allows me to do this work, one is the exposure I've had to see what things can look like in a radically different type of environment like Eileen Fisher, but still being at my core a systems thinker and a consultant for over 20 years. And so always looking at, okay, where's the opportunity for the introduction to the invitation? And so in one environment, in a defense contractor, I was asked, so we want you to talk about compassion, but from a military voice. I'm like, what the hell was that? I'm like, okay. And I'm like, all right, we can do this. But the invitation was, you have a cross-generational workforce and leaders are out of touch with the youngest members of their teams. And they're losing employees. And so that the attraction and retention is becoming a real issue, especially right now in a post-pandemic era. And so looking at that as the introduction of, okay, here's a real business need or challenge. And then within that, we can start to look at the zeitgeist of how things are changing in society, and from the vantage point of a boomer versus a Gen Zer. And from that perspective, we can start to introduce new concepts, new ideas that are going to have a different connection to well-being, to performance, to resilience, to trust. And so being able to look at where there are places to introduce these new concepts in ways that will be thought-provoking, create paradigm shifts in thinking, and create opportunities to say, all right, maybe I can see this from a different perspective when I look at what's happening in my own relationship to it from my own perspective. Is there a way I can look at this differently?
Yeah.
And so that's typically what I've found. So I spend a lot of time managing my expectations and helping others to manage their expectations. And then really looking for where are those opportunities to introduce new ideas and concepts in environments where it's still going to be foreign, where it's still going to be unfamiliar, or where that fear is still going to be pervasive, that are we going to lose what we've had? I think the reality is we're at a point in time where power dynamics are changing so quickly. And, I often say I work with leaders and men in particular at the root of the power centers, where the power dynamics are shifting. So where the wounding in us wants to hold on to power versus the opportunity is, how do we start to look at shared distribution of power in a very different way? So we're in power with versus power over. And to move in those directions, that's where I think that a lot of the personal transformation, a commitment to personal transformation work and leadership is critical. So going back to your original question, I think an investment in the deeper work and the deeper reflection, the deeper introspection is not often an investment that organizations are going to make from a financial perspective or a time perspective. Yet it's what I think is going to be critical to be able to transforming organizations to adapt to what's going to be relevant for the future.
Yeah, and you saw that and you helped lead that at Eileen Fisher. And that's often what we're recommending with our clients at JumpScale. And even with investors who are investing in startups who really have a belief in a new type of economy, it is so hard to get organizations, investors to put those resources in to deep transformational work. It's creating a space for emergence that makes a lot of folks, even folks very progressive minded people, there's like an anxiety and there's a fear that comes up so quickly when you talk about like the level of investment that might actually get you to where you want to go, but it's not a type of investment in deeper work that people have done in the past. It really is tough. But I think there are examples of it. There's examples of investors. There's a commitment to mental health now within the investment community, within the progressive investment community, mental health of the founders that they're investing in. But more often than not, people want healing and they want equity and inclusion on the cheap. They basically want to minimize the cost of that because it's seen as kind of a risk mitigation strategy. It's like, how do we mitigate the risk of like a diversity and inclusion crisis? How do we mitigate the risk of burnout? And I think the work ahead is to kind of shift that risk mitigation to one of like centering these things, inclusivity in the sense of like, our organizations need to be safe for people of all different backgrounds to be powerful and authentic and creative. There needs to be safety. There needs to be deep psychological safety. Organizations can be centered on that, not just investing in them as a risk mitigation, thing on the side. So that's something I see again and again. And you mentioned that kind of looking for the invitation and looking for the openings. We often, and many of my colleagues are brought in when there's, been a there's civil unrest. There's a racial reckoning going on in our country. There's anxiety that among the leaders of a company that they're not diverse enough. So there's kind of like an opening that gets created to do diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It comes from a kind of superficial, and sometimes superficial, but sometimes from a really an unknowing. Like the leaders don't know what a new culture in their organization looks like. And so they ask for help. And so that opening kind of seems to be pretty common right now. But oftentimes I've experienced it and I've supported others with this. A lot of white men, I know we've talked about this, don't know what their role is in that. So there's an interesting, tension and, white men struggling to find their new identity or their new role or their new place in this moment for organizations to shift their culture. And I think the other thing that often I've seen, and sometimes it happens in the diversity, equity, inclusion conversation, sometimes it happens in kind of bigger crises within organizations, is instead of doing that deeper inner work that's required, getting therapists involved, getting professionals, working with kind of organizational trauma and organizational healing work, instead of doing deeper work, there are these kind of, I would almost call them like spiritual bypassing, where it's like, oh, we're going to bring in a meditation teacher. Or there's even worse can be like, we're going to take our team to a shamanic retreat. And it's not really followed up with like a long-term commitment. It's kind of these one-off things that sound transformative, but actually don't, they're not sustainable. They sometimes really can be really a bypass, I would say, from doing that deeper work. And in worst cases are just really extractive and kind of culturally appropriating in some really challenging ways. So those are some of the things that I think are kind of close to what we're talking about, but are missing or kind of still undercutting the level of change that I think we both know is needed.
You know, as you're talking, and as I'm going through, just kind of thinking different pieces that are missing, and I was just on a conversation with some of my colleagues in the police team just before this, and a lot, you know, in my book and in the work I'm doing, I've often taken out, because I tend to, when I think about helping the soul healing for men, I often look at, so who is my targets, my target audience, who are the hardest to reach, you know, and when I think about, you know, the extremes, when I think about white nationalists, when I think about folks that conceivably be in the different environments that I'm in, and how do I reach those men around their healing? And I just take a lot of the language that I would normally use in some of my progressive circles to say that's not going to be applicable in these environments. And so I've really come to asking myself, where's the suffering and where's the healing? And where's the silent suffering? And often I look at that both in life and then in organizations, where people, especially in more masculine environments, you know, shouldering the burden without letting anyone know or asking for help. And so I think that also undercuts. And I think when I look at ultimately what tends to be the silent suffering, it's coming down to just disconnection to connection. You know, disconnection from self, disconnection from spirit, disconnection from others, disconnection from community. And as I'm in conversations with Senate staffers on the Judiciary Committee talking about men's mental health and mass shootings and police suicides, and realizing that in these conversations, the common denominator is that level of disconnection. And the yearning that we don't talk enough about or create opportunities enough for is deeper connection. You know, that introspection and deeper connection to self, that deeper connection to something beyond ourselves, and that deeper connection to others and feeling of belonging in community. And I think that can be another piece that can disconnect, and what may intrude upon that, interfere with that, can often be where a lot of shame resides, where a lot of fear resides, where a lot of anger resides, where a lot of rage resides. I think we're seeing that in the level of violence that we're seeing, you know, just across this country and in general. So I think that when we talk about the investment in mental health, sometimes it's going to a select few. And the other part of it is a lot of people who need it the most are not going to know how to ask, or feel they can ask, or maybe too afraid or have shame around asking.
Absolutely.
So I think that's another element to what can undercut some of these great intentions.
Yeah. Well, we're getting toward the end of our hour, and you know, you've been working on your book. It's coming out early next year. So everybody keep an eye out for Warrior Compassion. So I know you've been thinking a lot about design principles, and you've been, you know, deep inside different organizations to really understand like what kinds of new frameworks, what kinds of new principles can we design around that really move us toward more balanced, move us beyond toxic masculinity and kind of move towards cultures of compassion. I know that's something you've been thinking really deeply about. You've been writing about it. So I'm curious, what for you are some of the top principles, or just what are some of the key concepts that you're finding or you feel like are important for any organization to be thinking about right now in this conversation?
I think the best doorway in is the work around human-centered workplace design. From this place of how do we bring our humanity, and how do we speak from a place of humanity in the workplace? I think so many of the other pieces that we might talk about can stem from how are we tapping into human-centered workplace design. Now the question is, are we giving lip service to it? Are we doing bypass around it? Or are we really understanding what it means to give permission in a culture for each person to bring their full humanity and authenticity into the workplace without it being culturally outside the bounds? And so, and organizations investing in the systems, the processes, the procedures to really allow for true humanity work in the workplace. Or is it just an idea or concept that's great to talk about, but doesn't necessarily embed throughout the organization? Because I think that's where the work is. I would say what I'm encouraged by is seeing more and more conversations around psychological safety, continuing to have conversations around trust.
Yes.
And what does vulnerability look like? Seeing the conversations around compassion and embodied compassion, and what does that look like in an environment? And I often will be asked this question of compassion versus accountability, or accountability with compassion. So how are you able to hold someone in their humanity while also being able to hold a level of accountability for what feels appropriate, what feels right, what feels like it's really elevating all of humanity. And something that I spend a lot of time talking about is compassionate bridge building. And so how do we build bridges across division, disconnection, and isolation? I think in our lifetimes, I speak, I don't think we've seen in our nation, in the US, so divided, so polarized, and so disconnected from each other. And the levels, when I look at the levels of suicide rates, violence rates, domestic violence rates, loneliness rates, isolation rates, trauma rates, they're at epic levels, and they're not decreasing, especially for men. And so that's where I again go back to when we think about mental health in the workplace, to really think about the ways that those who are suffering in silence may look great on paper, but may be suffering outside of the work environment that can impact the work environment, and how healthy is the workforce truly, across the board, not just for particular pockets of the organization where there's greater access to well-being initiatives and what have you, that is supported and embraced.
Yeah, you made me think of people on the call may know about health risk assessments. It was a tool that insurance companies and big human resource departments started coming up with, where like you could have all of your employees fill out essentially a brief, heart health, cardiovascular health survey. And that was their version back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s of a health risk assessment for a company's profile. And it really feels like we're at an era where, and there's starting to be some tools out there where we can really have integrative health kind of vitality metrics, and we can really be thinking about our whole teams and their vitality in a much more holistic way than we used to. And the other thing that just came up for me that I want to give a shout out to is the sanctuary organization movement, which is really about how do you build organizations that are trauma informed and really help people in organizations, from leaders to staff, really understand how trauma shows up in our teams, how it shows up for individuals, how it impacts companies. And a lot of that work came out of the social services space and the foster care system. And, where you've got frontline social workers and foster care people taking care of vulnerable children who have been displaced, taking care of people in our communities that are really struggling, and are relative doing it in silence in many cases, as you were just referring to. But the amount of trauma that starts to come up, that both the clients and the children and the employees begin to experience, can be really debilitating for an organization. So this sanctuary organization work really, I think, did a lot of early work in that space, but now there's tools and approaches that can help many organizations really be thoughtful about the trauma in the lives of their employees, trauma in the lives of the people that they serve, and be really thoughtful about safety, psychological safety, be thoughtful about how people can be more fully themselves. And I think that is some of the unspoken work of moving beyond the kind of hyper masculine organizational cultures we're in. Is it's not always just by talking about masculinity and femininity or men and women or gender. It's like, how do we heal? How do we create organizations where healing is fundamental and supported, so there can be safety, there can be that bridge building work you just talked about, for people to be more creative, authentic, for the organizations to feel more inclusive. Like, there's just a bunch of healing work that organizations can support now, that I think is going to feel new to a lot of people, but is not totally new. There's been a lot of work done in the workplace well-being world. There's been a lot of work done in trauma-informed organizations. There's been a lot of work in different types of masculine and feminine, healthy masculine and feminine balanced leadership, and your work around that kind of bridge building for cultures of compassion, I think, is going to make a huge difference in the next few years.
I just want to add, where I was most encouraged was when I was talking to Senate staffers and learning which bills have bipartisan support to address police suicides and veteran suicides, and senators that across the aisle who were really talking about trauma-informed practice as part of well-being, and that these were bills that were not, there was not a divide, and to see where there is bipartisan support at the national level, to be able to support trauma-informed practice to address, in this particular case, suicide, but also as we start to look at violence in different ways across different capacities.
Well, we're at the top of our hour, and I really love this conversation, Sean. I hope we have more. I hope we can kind of keep bringing this conversation, and the folks who are joined us today. Thank you all for joining us. I hope all of you will join this conversation with us. This is really a community process. You've heard a lot from Sean and I today, but reach out to us. And I haven't seen any questions popping up in it, but just to pass it to you, Sean, what's one thing that's giving you hope going into this summer, into the fall? We'll just end with that. What's one thing that's giving you some hope? And I'll do the same.
I think as we really start talking about the work specifically that we're doing around policing with compassion, how we're starting to see academic partnerships, support from different politicians, different corporations, and different departments and law enforcement leaders, both at the local, state, and federal levels. Not even flinching at this conversation and saying, yes, compassion is an important dimension. And I see compassion as a gateway to so much of this work, even from an inclusion and inclusion perspective, from a workplace well-being perspective, from a leadership perspective. This to me seems like it's a door opener to the inner work. How about for you?
Well, I think one of the most exciting things for me that gives me a lot of hope is at a pretty large scale, it feels like there's a lot of people in the United States that are willing to, that are like eager to have a conversation about the collective trauma that our culture as a white man, that white men have perpetuated in this country, but that many people have been a part of, and that it's a collective kind of reconciliation process that involves reconciliation, reparations, collective healing. So I keep seeing it on a daily basis in so many different parts of my life, from the political level to the community level, of people who are ready and eager to do that work at a large scale. And so I'm just feeling really hopeful about those kind of meta issues. And I feel like those meta collective issues absolutely affect the organizations and the businesses in our culture. So I'm feeling really grateful for that movement work that's happening. Thank you, Sean. And turn it back to Tulasi to close us out.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Sean, for this extremely thoughtful, important conversation. I really appreciated hearing this from both of you today, and I know our audience did too. In the chat, I actually put a link to the Warrior Compassion website, Sean, where I think folks can see what you're up to and also hear about book updates. Mm-hmm. And I also put a link for where you're going to find the recording for this session later today. So you can check it out there, and please share it, because I know so many will find value in this. So thank you again, Sean. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, everyone who stuck through and enjoyed today's session. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.